The first, at least, much more easily reconstructible, to the extent that it's reconstructible, chapter of genocidal history that I'd like to talk about is the Mongols and Genghis Khan, because they're, of course, a topic that never gets old. So roughly, to start us off, what's the story of their expansion? And then why does it get categorized by you as genocidal rather than, say, one that's just brutally violent and murderous, especially because you write that the Mongols weren't particularly interested in race or language or ethnicity or religion or any of the sorts of things that we contemporarily associate with genocide?
Okay, so in general, the 12th, 13th century, Mongols expanded into, well, they expanded all over Eurasia. I mean, they expanded into China, they expanded in the south, into, what you would call Turkestan and, areas of Central Asia. They expanded into Europe. They were stopped only in Europe. They expanded into Hungary, which was a particularly nasty case that I describe in the book. In their expansion, there were several elements of their expansion. And one level you can, just kind of categorize it as imperial expansion, and that's what it was. But the Mongols also killed groups of people. And in killing groups of people, I felt like you had to include it in the sort of history of genocide. And what they would do is, in here, they're killing groups of people, concrete groups of people, again, as such, right? Meaning they're trying to destroy the group, and they're killing them, again, not necessarily on racial, religious grounds, but because they opposed the Mongols, or the Mongols felt that they opposed them. So they would destroy whole civilizations based on cities, killing everyone, if, they didn't submit. If they submitted, that was another story. So in the case of Russia, for example, the Mongols were, the so-called Mongol yoke, as it's called in Russian history. There's a case where the Mongols would go in there and just, beat up on the Russians. And so the Russian cities eventually agreed to submit to the Mongols. And what did that mean? It meant paying them an annual tribute. It meant turning over some of their women to them. There was a lot of intermarriage, actually, between Mongol princes and Russian princely families. So there is a real kind of Eurasian combination that happens in Russia, where the Mongols and their various offshoots and the Russians, intermingle. But in some places, again, in Central Asia, in Hungary, elsewhere, China, people said, no, we're not going to submit. We're not going to pay you. We're not going to turn over all our women to you. And in the end, they're destroyed in whole. And they slaughter them. It's a real mass murder. The case of Hungary, which, again, I describe in the book, because we have a lot of interesting and well-placed eyewitnesses of what happened. In the case of Hungary, they just went town to town, and murdered everyone. And people tried to, men, women, and children. In this case, they didn't even take the women and children. They just murdered everyone. And, it was a catastrophe for the Hungarian nation. It's hard to know what percentage, how many tens of thousands of Hungarians died during the Mongol assault. We know the Hungarians didn't behave very well, too, that some Hungarians lined up with the Mongols as a way to try to avoid being destroyed. But they were destroyed. So whole peoples that are attacked as peoples, as such, with the intention of eliminating them, which is the essence of the genocide definition. So that's why, like I said, you could talk about the Mongols in in a kind of template of imperial expansion. And it's hard to separate sometimes imperial expansion from genocide. But in this case, I think it should be included in genocide as well.
Well, let me push back slightly against the definition of genocide, because at least to my ear, the force of the term genocide is it's based at to a large extent beyond just the number of deaths on hate that is based on the identity of the targeted group. And because if not, it seems like any particularly violent war over something innocuous or unrelated to identity, at least like a border dispute in which the losers sustain extreme casualties, it'll be called genocide even if the two peoples have similar group identities. But maybe what's crucial here is that even if the dispute is, so to speak, innocuous, the Mongols did have a different group identity from who they were subjugating.
Yeah. No, the pushback is not unusual and is not outside the realm of scholarly debate and, what people talk about. I mean, there are some scholars, for example, who think that you can't really separate war from genocide. I think that's not right, because there are some cases of genocide, and cases I've studied in Stalin or in Mao's China or Cambodia, were not inspired by war. I mean, those were all internal cases that there was no war going on when those peoples were attacked and destroyed. But it's certainly true that war breeds genocide. And in a war-like situation, it's hard to separate, okay, what's war, what's genocide? Even, again, taking something like today, the Russian attack on Ukraine, the people say that it's genocide, and some people say, well, it's just a warlike occupation, always, some people are going to get killed, that kind of thing. So you get, you get multiple ways of looking at this, and I have no objection to that. Let me just but let me say this, that genocide, and the courts have been very good about talking about this. Genocide is not about motivation. It's not if somebody hates somebody or not. Who cares? It's about intention. So do you intend to kill all or part of this group? And do you want to do it, and have you organized yourself to do it? Right? It's like a little bit like first-degree murder. Now, I know in a courtroom, motivation makes a difference. But in the courtroom of history, when it comes to genocide, motivation is not important. What's important is intent. And that's why it's hard, hard to sometimes prove intent. I mean, even in the part of people like Hitler and Stalin, it's hard because there's no order. Or Milosevic in Yugoslavia. There's no order that comes down. So you have to prove intent through their actual actions. In the case of the Mongols, they intended to kill those people. They organized, there was resistance. They said, okay, you're gone. You're out of here, basically. And they move in and they, lay siege, and then they kill everybody they can find and take the women away and the kids sometimes, because women and children are too valuable to kill. So I don't have any problem with pushback, and I don't have any problem with saying, genocide is not hard and fast. It's not, it's not something that's easy to categorize. In this, I mentioned to you, we have this 3-volume Cambridge World History of Genocide. The chief editor, as well as most of us who participated in the making of these books, sort of didn't want to get into an argument about what's genocide and what's not. We the various cases we look at, we don't want to spend a lot of time saying this is not genocide, this is genocide, if you know what I mean. In other words, what we want to do is point out, how these cases have characteristics like genocide, or not, and not get into a kind of yay or nay situation, because that's counterproductive. I mean, we had this, I don't know if you recall, but we had this a little bit with Darfur in the beginning of the century where, the question was, do we intervene in Sudan to stop the killing of the people in Darfur, the western part of Sudan, the western sections of Sudan? And the answer, depended a little bit on whether it was deemed genocide or not. I'm not sure that's a necessary thing itself, but that's how people interpreted it. Well, two things happened. One, the Bush administration said, yes, it's genocide. And the UN said, no, it's not genocide. They're dealing with the same facts. They're dealing with the same situation. They're dealing with the same, evaluators and primary documents and, people on the ground. So it strikes me that it's not a good thing to get an argument like that. If it's something that needs to be stopped and you can stop it, and, a form of mass killing, whether it's genocide or not genocide, you stop it if you can. You can't. I mean, I understand that. But I think it's just not productive, again, to get into these sorts of arguments. And then, when you work in genocide studies, as I have now, like I said, since the early 1990s, you realize that people always want to have their genocides. Peoples. Everybody wants their genocide. And I don't like that either. I mean, I don't think that's a good way to think about this set of problems either. And therefore, I like to sort of stay away from the is this genocide or is this not genocide kind of question, but instead use genocide as a kind of paradigm of a certain kind of international, national, political, murderous behavior that's part of our system. That's part of, I say system, I mean part of who we are, how we live, and how we live with each other, and how we live with people in the rest of the world. And I think it is part of it. And therefore I stick with it. Some people, I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's a recent, very interesting book by one of the most prominent genocide scholars in the world, a man named Dirk Moses. It's called The Problems of Genocide. And he wants us to give up the term. I mean, he doesn't like it anymore. I mean, he's one of the primary scholars in the field, and he says, nah, there's too many reasons why it's not a useful term. I disagree with him. I mean, he's got a very sophisticated, long, complicated argument. But fundamentally, I disagree with him. In other words, I think it's a useful term. I think we should stick with it. I think there are reasons to stick with it. But, there are plenty of, like I said, serious, well-informed. I mean, nobody could be more serious or more well-informed than Dirk about this. People who now are questioning the term altogether. He wants to create another term, but that's a different kind of question. I don't want to, don't want to get into that. But just as an example, in other words, the kind of pushback you give is always there. It's part of the story, and it's maybe a little bit, I don't know if there's a good analogy for this or not, but, like racism or even race, there are always pushbacks, yet racism and race is something that's part of our lives. We know it's there. We know what we're talking about when we talk about racism and race. And similarly with genocide, we know what we're talking about. The edges are blurry. They're not sharply defined. And that makes it difficult.
Well, I took down this name, Dirk Moses, because it's always nice to have multiple perspectives on an issue. So maybe we both know there's a lot of material to mine here. So maybe I'll be able to have him on at some point. But this might sound like a silly question, though I think it's important and might point possibly to a difference in humanity or cultures across time. But were the atrocities committed by the Mongols considered immoral. And surely that's a matter of perspective. I mean, I guess it's the story of genocide in the sense that the crusades weren't immoral. The genocides of the Bible, even the Holocaust, wasn't immoral for Hitler. So maybe I'm asking if by the contemporaries of the Mongols, their actions would have generally been decried as immoral in the same way
Sure.
they were. Okay.
Sure. I mean, sure, if you're the victim. Absolutely. I mean, if you remember the Hungarian, again, I point to this Hungarian part that I suggested to you. I mean, I'm blanking a moment on this churchman's name who wrote a very elaborate description of what happened in Hungary. And I cite him quite often. I mean, I can go find my book somewhere here, but I won't look it up right now. But he clearly thought this was immoral and was, unchristian and inhumane and wrong. And as he describes what happens, and we know what happens pretty much, women getting dressed up in their finery so that they hope that the Mongols will take them away instead of killing them, and they kill them anyway. He feels that it's a totally immoral situation and a horrible situation. And I'm sure the people, in Kharazm and some of these other towns in Central Asia, who were attacked by the Mongols, and also in China, where there was a lot of damage done. We don't really have a great sense of the numbers in China who were killed by the Mongols, but we're talking millions of people. Clearly they thought that was immoral. Just like Jews, Poles, and Russians thought it was immoral what the Nazis were doing to them. Nazis didn't think it was immoral.
Right. The distinction, though, that I see, and maybe this will make my question sound more plausible in case it didn't, the distinction between something like the Holocaust and the Mongol expansion is, let's say somebody's on death row today for multiple rapes and murders. Certainly they don't want to be killed, but they will presumably grasp that their executioner is not, well, it depends on their views on the death penalty. They might not think that their executioner is immoral. And in the case of the Mongol expansion, my understanding is that I think you mentioned there were 3 templates of Mongol expansion, but they gave people an ultimatum. They said, look, you can give us fealty essentially, or these are the consequences. Sorry for my co-host. But I don't know if 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, the times of the Bible, this was sort of the law of the land where it was accepted. You could make an ultimatum like this, and if you made the wrong choice, then you suffered the consequences, and that's just how it was. But what it sounds like to me is that this isn't the case. Back then, it would have been considered totally immoral by the non.
Yeah, okay. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, think about, yeah, let's leave it. Yeah, go on.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Well, no, I just think it's, from the perspective of the victims of genocide. I mean, you think you are being destroyed because you are a member of a group. I mean, you're not even singled out, right? I mean, again, I mean, maybe again, using the Holocaust as an example is a good way to do this. You're a German of Jewish background, one Jewish grandmother, and you're being killed just like the full Jew who's very pious and you say to yourself, well, what is the reasoning there, right? There is no reasoning. It's a sheer killing. I mean, it's a sheer impulse to destroy a people on the part of those who are destroying it. So you're not being destroyed as an individual necessarily by the person who's destroying you, but you are an individual with your own differences. So it's always immoral then. And the person on death row, I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for the person on death row. I think that's too much for me.